Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this short presentation, which originally was given at an Oxford mini-conference organized by Peter Frankopan on the climate and the Roman, late Antique, and Byzantine worlds on the 24th of March 2021. The image on the first slide stems from the Skoriotissa copper mining area in the northwest of Cyprus. This mining area was already exploited in the Bronze Age, but especially busy in the Roman and Byzantine periods, from when some of the largest ancient slag heaps in the eastern Mediterranean date. Such heritage of economic activities of the past can have an enduring impact on present ecologies, as the example of another long-term mining area around Küre in modern-day northern Turkey indicates. Ackerman Keskin and Oesler demonstrate in their recent paper that both present as well as past mining activities contributed to a strong heavy metal contamination of groundwater and surface water in the surroundings of Küre. The copper mine of Küre was most probably already exploited in the Byzantine period, but became especially important in the late medieval centuries. Launikos Kalkokondylis informs us that its revenues enriched first the princes of the Isfendi in Kastamonu, and then the Ottoman sultans before and after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Not only the revenues, but also the ore of the Kürmine met the requirements of the urban metabolism of Constantinople for raw materials. These inputs, of course, resulted in outputs of Constantinople's metabolism in the form of sewages, smoke, and waste. One sink for these outputs, especially between the 5th and 11th century, was the Theodosius harbor in Yenikap in Istanbul, not only because of the commercial activity in the port area, but also due to its position at the end point of various inflows at the mouth of the Likus River. A team from Istanbul Technical University demonstrated in 2018 that, according to modern-day limit values, sediments of the Theodosius harbor from the early as well as Middle Byzantine period show heavy to extreme contamination levels for metals such as arsenic, cobalt, chromium, zinc, copper, and lead. Lead did not only accumulate in soils and water bodies near mining or production sites, but equally evaporated into the atmosphere and descended into deposits hundreds, or as the ice cores from Greenland demonstrate, thousands of kilometers away. Lead concentration levels from sediments in one such sphinx on the Balkans were published in 2018 by Jack Longman and his team. The Crveni Potok bog is situated in the Tara Mountains National Park in modern-day western Serbia. Despite its remote location, wind flows exposed the site to emissions from the many mining sites in the western and northern Balkans, where ore mining started especially in the late medieval times, but in some cases also centuries before in the Roman and Byzantine periods. The authors of the study therefore argue that the different concentrations of lead over time reflect the intensity of mining and metallurgical activities in the wider surroundings of Crveni Potok in the last millennia. Similar data has been extracted from other mining areas of the past, such as in northwestern Spain. There the peak lead concentration during the Roman time even outperformed the climax of lead emission in the 20th century before the reduction of the use of leaded gasoline. Remarkably, the Byzantine peak of lead concentration in Crveni Potok is 5 times higher than the modern-day peak in northwestern Spain and more than double the Roman time peak from that region. However, thus this notable amount of pollution, traceable in sediments even centuries after 1453, allow us to claim the status of a geological superpower for our beloved empire of the Romei, in order to talk about the Byzantine Anthropocene. From a geologist's perspective, thinking not in millennia but eons, only the modern industrialized society, which from the mid-1940s onwards produced artificial radioactive elements, detectable even in millions of years, would qualify as starting point of the Anthropocene. Yes, there are various proposals for an earlier start of the geological age of humans, dating back even to the rise of agriculture more than 10,000 years ago, when farming communities began to transform the planet at a totally different scale. Such a long or early Anthropocene equally runs against the narrative which would focus exclusively on the last 2 centuries of industrialized capitalism, or even only on the Anglocene, as it has been called, highlighting the two Anglophone superpowers of the capitalist age, first Great Britain and then the United States of America. If we define the Anthropocene by acknowledging that the familiar divide between people and the natural world is no longer useful or accurate, since human societies shape and shaped everything from the upper atmosphere to the deep seas, then also Byzantium has its place in it, as my introductory examples have shown. Just to make sure, the Byzantine Anthropocene is around in scholarship for some years now. One of the earliest studies I'm aware of is the wonderful book of Adam G. Goldwyn from 2017. I personally profited enormously from the discussions with historians, archaeologists, and scientists such as Elena Xoblaki in the Climate Change and History Research Initiative started by John Holden at Princeton. If we now return to Crveni Potok, we could interpret its data as measurement for the intensity of one aspect of the Byzantine Anthropocene in time. We may also be tempted to correlate the fluctuations of the lead concentration with well-known periods of climate change or epidemic outbreaks, which could have reduced mining activities and metal production, as Longman and his co-authors did in this graph in their study of 2018. However, the dating of the Crveni Potok sediments, which is not annually resolved but only allows for a data point every few decades, like pollen datasets, leaves us with many uncertainties regarding actual temporal overlaps with extreme events such as epidemics, not to speak about the actual mode of impact of such events on past mining communities. But the study authors provide another interesting and more reliable comparison with lead concentration data from other sites in Western Europe. It indicates two interesting temporal divergences. While the data from Spain, which we already have seen, and Switzerland shows a dramatic decline of lead levels with the disintegration of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, this is not the case for Crveni Potok in the Eastern Roman Empire, despite the turbulent history of the Balkans in this period. The Crveni Potok data, however, shows an even more dramatic decline of lead levels in the 18th and 19th century, when the trajectories in Switzerland and Spain show a significant increase, which can be related to the so-called Industrial Revolution in Western Europe. This evidence may pose two questions. First, are barbarians good for the environment? This statement stems from the famous historian of China, Mark Alvin, who observed that the frequency of documented dam breaches along the Yellow River significantly decreased with the collapse of the Empire of the Han in the 3rd century, most probably since the decline of population densities and of the intensity of land use also reduced erosion dynamics. Along similar lines, the lead emissions from Western Europe decreased with the fragmentation of the Roman Empire, as can be measured even in the ice cores from faraway Greenland. Second, and more relevant for my talk today, can we connect the observed divergences in the lead concentration dynamics in Western Europe and on the Byzantine and Ottoman Balkans with the most intense debate in the field of global history, that is on the so-called Great Divergence between Northwestern Europe and the rest of the world regarding the emergence of industrialized capitalism and modern-day affluent societies. This debate originally and still very much circles around the question why Europe grew rich and Asia and especially China did not, and somehow like the discussion on the start of the Anthropocene on when the decisive divergent developments took place, with answers ranging from the early 1800s back to the fall of Rome, as in the recent book of Walter Scheidel. In 2020, Victor Court reviewed the literature on the Great Divergence since the original eponymous book of Kenneth Pomeranz from 2000 and even before, and identified three categories of deep determinants proposed in scholarship. Of course, most studies suggest a mixture of biogeographical, cultural, institutional, and contingent conjunctural factors. Climate and epidemics play a role either among the long-term biogeographical determinants or as contingent factors, dramatically modifying demographic parameters as in the case of the Black Death, or contributing to the failure of unifying imperial projects which allowed for continuous political fragmentation in Western Europe, for instance. As still in many subfields of global history, the place of Byzantium in the Great Divergence debates is insignificant. Sometimes one finds references to the Byzantine Empire based on accidental readings in secondary literature, such as this statement that the Byzantines either forgot all philosophical and scientific works of the ancient Greeks or banned them as heretical literature. Equally unsatisfying for Byzantinists is the observation that their field of study disappears among arbitrary spatial classifications, such as in this study on urban development in Europe and the Middle East between 800 and 1800, which, based on modern-day borders, attributes the demographics of Thessaloniki to Europe and of Constantinople to the Middle East. This paper equally highlights the problematic empirical basis of many such studies, where unjustified confidence in guesstimates on demographic and socioeconomic indicators for ancient or the medieval societies is combined with impressively sophisticated mathematics. The study by Keywood and Button, cited on the left, for instance, tries to determine elite numeracy in European societies of the past 1,500 years based on the share of rulers for which a date of birth can be found, being unaware that such dates do not come from early medieval registry offices, but calculations or estimates of modern scholars. The pitfalls of this sometimes naive zeal for quantification have been highlighted recently even within the community of economic historians by Hatcher and Stevenson in their volume on 7 Centuries of Unreal Wages. However, returning to the possible role of climatic factors in the Great Divergence, one claim about underlying differences in local climates has been made for the use of watermills. As the Austrian historian Michael Mitterauer argued, hydrological conditions favored the use and further development of watermills in northwestern and central Europe for the benefit of proto-industrial development, while the contrary was true for the Mediterranean and the Middle East, especially due to summer droughts. Bas van Bavel and his co-authors, however, in a paper on the Islamic world in 2018 argued that the decline in the use of watermills there, which they claimed to have quantified from written sources, was not the result of climatic conditions, but institutional changes in the control over landed property from the 10th century onwards. They also refer to the studies of Andrew Wilson, which highlight the use of watermills even at a proto-industrial scale, both in the west and the east of the Roman Empire. Absent again, however, from this study is the evidence for watermills in the Byzantine Empire. The fate of the Roman Empire in Western Europe is equally the point of divergence for Walter Scheidel, who in various working papers and finally his monograph of 2019 contrasted the continuous political fragmentation of the post-Roman West with the imperial reunification of China in the late 6th century after it had experienced a similar period of political division from the 3rd century onwards. In the long term, as Scheidel, like others before him, argues, the escape from Roman political unity allowed for a more effective competition of institutions and ideas in fragmented Western Europe, culminating in the European expansion and Industrial Revolution. Within this first great divergence, Scheidel identifies a first little divergence in the footsteps of Chris Wickham, who had contrasted the weak polities of the post-Roman West with the strong states of the Eastern Mediterranean, such as Byzantium and the Caliphate, which were still able to raise taxes and armies. They were, however, not strong enough to enforce imperial unity on entire Western Eurasia, as the Romans had done, again to the long-term benefit of Western Europe, as Scheidel argues. The ultimate failure of Justinian's project of imperial renovation, therefore, would have contributed to this first great divergence, and the climatic downturn in the 6th century towards the late antique Little Ice Age, together with the Justinianic plague, would have played a role in it, even if the actual demographic impact of the pandemic has been strongly debated recently. In contrast to Justinian's empire, we have census figures for 6th century northern China, which however do not allude to a similar demographic downturn there as hypothesized by Karl Harper for Byzantium. Yet Scheidel was not the first who argued for a first great divergence ahead of the early modern one. Robin Ian Moore used the term for the different outcomes of 2 attempts of intellectual reform in the 11th century. The successful one of the popes of the Western Church, symbolized with the submission of secular powers in Canossa in 1077, and the unsuccessful one of Wang Anshi and his followers in Song China. While the first reinforced what Moore had called Europe's first revolution, the second allegedly contributed to an institutional path detrimental to long-term growth and innovation. Interestingly, extreme weather events played a role in Wang Anshi's failure, as Ling Shang has pointed out in her great monograph of 2016. A core element of Wang Anshi's agenda were hydroengineering efforts to revert the Yellow River to its streambed before the flood disaster of 1048, which can be related to a series of extreme weather events across Afro-Eurasia during the so-called Oort solar minimum. To Wang Anshi's misfortune, another sequence of flood disasters undid all earlier efforts and led to his dismissal as prime minister. Yet despite these extreme events, and like Western Europe or also Byzantium, China experienced sustained demographic and economic growth in the 11th century, which, however, in turn aggravated the erosion dynamics and risk for floods along the Yellow River. And equally, the demographic and economic growth of the period, both in the medieval West as well as in Byzantium, did not contribute to social and political stability. Pre-existing power arrangements were destabilized due to the unequal distribution of the fruits of growth, as I also argue in my recently published monographs. Finally, Bruce Campbell connected the Great Transition, which allowed Western Europe to grow level with the wealth of China and eventually opened the path to the Great Divergence, with the transition from the medieval climate anomaly to the Little Ice Age and especially the Black Death plague pandemic. These calamities terminated the earlier growth period in Western Europe as they did in medieval Greece, for instance. Both in Western Europe as in the Mediterranean, the demographic losses affected an increase of wages for the remaining workforce, as Shevket Pamuk tried to demonstrate. By the mid-15th century, however, he argues that another little divergence opened between the northwest of Europe, where wages remained on a higher level, and the Mediterranean, where wage levels decreased, again to the detriment of long-term growth perspectives. Instead of the Byzantines, now the Ottomans were on a wrong path of history. The sea powers of Western Europe, however, started to expand across the Atlantic to a new world. The access to the resources of the Americas has been identified as another determinant for the Great Divergence. Less gloriously, Jason Moore has identified the exploitation of cheap nature and cheap labor as opportunity for Western European nations to outsource ecological and social costs of their economic growth overseas. Historians of the Eastern Mediterranean, however, may ask if we should not date the start of this Capitalocene to the time when the Levant and the Romania were integrated as Europe's first overseas into a new late medieval world system from the 13th century onwards. The exploitation of cheap nature for sugar plantations ahead of the islands of the Atlantic was already tested in crusader states such as Cyprus, before deforestation and the turn towards more arid conditions in the incipient Little Ice Age imposed ecological limits to this business. Similar observations on the non-sustainability of the wood and water-intensive sugar industry in the face of climate change have been made for Jordan in the Mamluk period in the study of Laparido and Rosen of 2015, and a paper under the leadership of Elena Xoblaki I had the honor to contribute in 2018. Ultimately, I would argue that we need more such dense descriptions of entanglements between ecology, society, and climate for microregions in order to get beyond the fuzziness and the blindness of the bird-eyes view of grand narratives such as the Great Divergence. Another example with which we return to the Byzantine Anthropocene are the recent fascinating findings on late antique viticulture in the Negev. Archaeological and environmental studies at sites such as Shifta have uncovered the relation between the breeding of pigeons, the excrements, and the use of otherwise arid soils in combination with ingenious irrigation. High concentrations of phosphor and nitrogen have been identified as long-term heritage of early Byzantine agriculture around the dovecotes more than 1,400 years after the field's abandonment in the mid-6th century. Daniel Fuchs and his colleagues stated in 2020 that contracting markets for the Negev wine, which before had been exported via Gaza to the entire Mediterranean, were a likely proximate cause for the decline. Possible triggers include climate change towards the late antique Little Ice Age, plague, and wider socio-political developments. And in long-term historical perspective, the unprecedented commercial florescence of the late antique Negev appears to have been unsustainable, reverting to an age-old pattern of smaller-scale settlements and survival subsistence strategies within a time frame of about 2 centuries. Based on such studies, We should try to integrate Byzantium into the grand narratives of the Anthropocene and the Great Divergence, or others will continue to do it, not necessarily doing justice to the actual significance of Byzantine history for ancient and medieval Afro-Eurasia. At the same time, the comparably sophisticated state-of-the-art of environmental and climate studies in our field will help to highlight the problems in these global debates in terms of perspectives and methods, identifying Byzantium and the non-Western world no longer only as an aberration from or an imitation of a generically defined Western European path to capitalism or into the Anthropocene. Thank you very much for your attention.